A proportion of people at Cambridge no longer have to write essays. They simply write bullet points on grounds of certain mental health or anxiety concerns. If that's real, that's one thing. But if they can't do this core exercise, which for centuries has been how Cambridge teaches, then Cambridge cannot be what it has been.
Hello and welcome to The View from 22. I'm Cindy Yu, The Spectator's assistant editor. Is university what it once was? Dr. David Butterfield writes in this week's Spectator magazine that actually after 21 years of teaching at Cambridge, teaching classics, that the university, once known as being elite, rigorous, and really putting students through their paces, is now infantilizing these students instead. And he has sadly resigned. David joins me now, together with the author and free speech writer, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan and David, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, David, if I could start with you, can you tell us about what happened to you at Cambridge?
Thank you, Cindy. It's a pleasure to be here. It may sound as though there was some specific event which prompted me to resign from a permanent position at Cambridge. I was employed through to the 2050s as a classicist, but it's not actually the case that one particular thing caused me to resign. As my article in this week's magazine details at some length, it's really a holistic account of what I see as decline across a wide range of sectors within Cambridge in particular, but which I think are a reflection of the higher education sector more broadly. So I can enter into what some of those are, but there are a lot of things rather than just one.
Give us some of those examples, if you will, just to illustrate the case.
So the great majority are things that really I've seen only start to happen in the last 10 years. I was at Cambridge for just over 20 years, and the first decade, not a great deal changed in terms of how the university, which is 9 centuries old, operated. But in the last 10 years, a lot has changed. And just to give you some headlines as to what those things are, I've seen a decline in the very rigor and intensity of the academic journey, particularly of undergraduates, but also of graduates too. I've seen syllabuses pared back. I've seen exams watered down in both content and in format. I've seen the admissions of students become much more dubious in terms of its mode of operation, despite in some senses improving. It's not obviously good across the board. I've seen a general decline in the relationship, not just between academics and students on their shared intellectual journey, but also between employees and the university proper. The growth of the administrative sector has introduced several problems, which in theory they are meant to remove from the educative process. So those would be major issues, which are all tied together in complex ways, but it's really very hard to disaggregate all of these separate entities into one simple problem.
And is there something like a basic cause underneath all of this, such as, you phrased it, I think, as the infantilization of education, that makes it broader than just the Cambridge issue for viewers?
Yes, so it is difficult. I think in a UK context, which does differ from America historically, the introduction of tuition fees and the scaling up of tuition fees has manifestly done what we said it would do when this was debated many years ago, namely create the space where students might feel they're customers, but much more materially, because I don't blame the students for the most part here, the university has wanted to treat the students as customers and therefore to minimize complaints and anything that might get in the way of their fee income. And by virtue of that, all sorts of aspects of university life, which might cause difficulty, might cause stress, might cause anxiety, have been rowed back in the belief that it's going to somehow harm the student experience and student satisfaction, and therefore the way we did it is no longer appropriate. And sadly, in several cases, that means a watering down and a winnowing away of the core activity of an elite university.
Now, Ayaan, through your work, through your career, you have been near universities, you have been close to higher education, you have been caring deeply about the issue of for example, free speech, and the trend of Western civilization, I think it's fair to say. Is this something that you've been seeing as well?
Absolutely. I have seen everything that David describes in Cambridge, but I've seen it in other universities. I don't know if you know, my husband Neil Ferguson has started a new institution, the University of Austin, with private backers from in the US. And the reasons for starting this new institution are exactly the same reasons as that David is giving. And the only sort of it's like the only other way, instead of using the words to infantilize students, I would say what I'm seeing is a shift of universities away from free inquiry, especially elite universities that were selective and rigorous, again, as David describes in his piece. They're shifting away from this foundation in free inquiry to what I would first say this is the managerial university where you produce students that are managed and programmed, and then those graduates will serve in the managerial government agencies and in corporations. And this is this whole agenda to transform democratic societies from these, I would say, fabulously free and loud and chaotic societies that we are to these uniform conformist, where human beings are just pieces of pawns, very much like a society in China. When I finished reading David's piece, I was instantly reminded of another piece written by a man who's brilliant, a young American man, N.S. Lyons, and he wrote this on Substack, and it's called The China Convergence. And he's describing how the elite in the United States is moving towards what he calls the managerial state. Now, to run the managerial state, you obviously need a whole corps of people who have been trained to recognize the various agencies, administrative agencies of the state. And that is how universities are being deployed. And again, as David says, the UK and other European countries are downstream of American culture. And I think you are now seeing what Americans woke up to, and Americans are resisting it. Thank goodness. I think this whole election it's a verdict on all of these changes, and hopefully, I was just making small talk with David before you came on, and I was saying I wish you hadn't left the university, but yeah, I think it's better to wake up later than never in this case.
It also seems like it's a minority of students. You know, you talk about this kind of homogenization of what's acceptable on campus, but from David's piece and from what we seem to know is that it's a minority of vocal voices who actually have a lot of sway. Like Ayaan, we've talked on Spectator TV before about the political opinion that's acceptable to have on campus, but often that doesn't take into the majority mainstream account who are fearful of speaking out.
It's obviously, yes, it's a minority of students. First of all, think about it. Who would apply to Cambridge University? Normally, it would be the highest achieving students who are seeking this free inquiry and selective and rigorous method of teaching. So yes, everywhere where I see it's a minority of students who are primed by this ever-growing managerial or administrative bulk of people that are brought into universities. There is this incentivization of the students who conform to these lowering of standards, the microaggressions. I don't know if you're familiar with any of these terms that some of the jargon that they introduced. The university is too elite, so to be able and to be to be outstanding in your ability is in itself these days a crime. And so that's where you see this lionizing of disabilities and bringing in. So yes, it does start with minorities, but you can't transform an institution immediately by flooding it with a majority of the population you want. It starts with these tiptoe, small groups of students, small groups of administrators, one or two professors here or there, over a long period of time, slowly but methodically expanding, changing the school boards, changing everything, changing the curriculum, and then reducing the standards and everything. So over a long period of time, you said 2 decades, and I think 2 decades is just about the right time before you can come and flip the institution where now you have the most accomplished professors like David leaving. And once that happens, once you get the exodus of the people who upheld the core principles of the institution then falls into their hands. And that's exactly what we should resist.
Yes, and David, on that disabilities point, I mean, there's a cynical aspect here where, of course, we're seeing, mental health being talked about much more in society as a whole. And, this rather cynical aspect is that actually are people using this or overdiagnosing themselves as an excuse for to justify some kind of infantilization. You've got an incredible stat here that 1 in 4 students in Cambridge have some kind of disability claim. I mean, leaving aside, underdiagnosis in the past, that just seems incredible. Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
It is, and of course it's a reflection of the much broader and much discussed phenomenon of the mental health crisis. And I certainly am not qualified to break that down into its parts. But what's completely apparent to me is that the scale of increase in Cambridge and in other universities must exceed underdiagnosis and lack of declaration in the past. And those involved in the university think it's going to continue to grow to between a third and maybe up to towards half of students with a self-declared disability. That's simply such a large number, 6,000 students now within Cambridge, that it is not possible to tailor in each case the student experience and the learning process to each individual. So my complaint in the piece is less that people with mental health problems are declaring them. No, I'm of course not saying that. It's that there's a blanket imposition of things that should change if you have a disability in one of these various categories. And in some cases, that is obstructing the process by which the university is meant to operate. I mentioned in the piece about the weekly supervision essay, where you write 1, 2, 3,000 words on a really complex topic. You read widely, you craft your argument, and then it's debated with an expert for over an hour. Well, a proportion of people at Cambridge no longer have to write essays. They simply write bullet points on grounds of certain mental health or anxiety concerns. If that's real, that's one thing. But if they can't do this core exercise, which for centuries has been how Cambridge teaches, then Cambridge cannot be what it has been.
And the thing is, and here, this is the whole point. Cambridge is being transformed into something else, and it's supposed to produce graduates who are incapable of critical thinking, because in this new, brave new world we're entering, we don't want critical thinkers. We don't want people who are going to ask questions or who are going to resist whatever it is that the administrative state imposes on them. So that, I think, is the point. It's just that we're grasping it much later today than, say, 10 years ago. I think if people understood this 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the resistance would have been much tougher.
Well, Ayaan, forgive me, but we have been talking about snowflake millennials, for example, for probably at least 10 years. I mean, I remember when I was at university just under 10 years ago, the thing that got me interested in The Spectator was an article that Brenda O'Neill had written at the time called A Step for Students, actually based on some of the things happening on campus while I was there. For example, no platforming, a male panel talking about abortion rights, because for the students at the time had said it was a safety issue for them. So this kind of language of fragility was already a phenomenon. What makes it so pervasive or immediate now? Is it just because it's been going on for so long?
I think that as you say, 10 years ago, when we were talking about the fragility of students, we were blaming them. We were saying, oh, it's this generation that hasn't experienced anything. What we didn't really understand was this is manufactured. This is a confected thing. Students were, Gen Z students, in terms of their resilience, I don't think were any different from the millennials or prior to that, but they were actively infantilized, or students that were actively infantilized as a minority were let loose on these universities, and then their complaints were amplified for us to believe, or we were made to believe that this was generation wide. It wasn't, and it isn't. There's an agenda behind this, and to say this is to think in terms of conspiracy theories, but I think it's very subversive. I have met students from Harvard, from Stanford, from Cambridge, and they say the majority of their classes do work extremely hard. And they thought when they go through the admissions process that they're going to these very exclusive, competitive classrooms, and then they find that their classes are subverted, they are heckled, professors are heckled, and the groups that are doing this, the administrators and faculty and students, are really a small minority, small, but now growing. So over time, obviously, they have grown to the point where, I don't know about Cambridge, but in these other institutions, professors are just too terrified to say anything. So there's this reign of terror within the American elite universities between the students who want free inquiry and the professors who are offering free inquiry and critical thinking. And then everyone else is just, there's the whole cynicism of it all. But again, this is, it's breaking open, and there are now two schools of thought on how to treat this problem. One is, do we bury the old institutions and say they're rotten, they're too broken to be amended, and start new institutions from scratch? Or do we fight for the existing institutions? My answer to that is, I think it's very important to do both, but in terms of fighting for the existing institutions, it cannot be that people like David leave or are forced to leave.
Well, David, tell us about what it's been like as you have been on the inside watching these trends change the university that you love. I assume you fought back. What was that process like?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, if you pledge your career to an institution and to a subject that you love, and you see things moving in a direction that you think will be not to the good, but to the detriment of the institution, you attempt to fight back. And one can do that in Cambridge on committees, within colleges, within faculties, on university committees. But over time, I saw that for the most part, the things that could be changed by a committee were no longer possible to change by committee, because too many people had been co-opted onto those boards who simply did not see the problem, or took what I regard as the problem as something that's perfectly good. And in a relatively democratic university system, that simply wasn't going to self-correct internally. So I fought back against the most egregious missteps in the university as best I could. And I want to make two things clear on this score. One is that a very large proportion of academics at Cambridge and at similar universities see the things that I'm writing about and agree with the majority of them. I've got no question about that. Emails are flooding in to me, by the minute as I speak to you now, from colleagues, most of whom I've never met. So what I write is not a fringe position, and therefore most academics are sound on the core business of being an elite university. Secondly, I agree with what Ayaan said, insofar as the majority of students want to be pushed, want to be tested, want to be challenged, and they have that hunger for knowledge that really is part of the human spirit. So I don't see the students as the problem. I see in particular a class of administrator and a class of academic which abets a class of student, all minorities, that are able to come together and create change on a scale that actually affects the whole ecosystem of the university. And it's not happening just in Cambridge, it's not happening just in Britain, it's not just happening in the Anglosphere, it's happening in most of our elite universities. And it's so holistic that it can't be traced back to a particular source or to a particular plan. It's simply managed decline, which is in the interests of certain groups within the university. So I agree that if someone like me who feels this way resigns, that is someone stepping outside of the university, which he could have fought back from within. That held me back from leaving for a long time. But my personal calculus, Cindy, is that I can do more for the subject I love, and indeed for the University of Cambridge, which I love, externally than I can internally, by modelling the core aspects of a humanities education. I'm a classicist, as you know, outside the institution, and showing how it can be done better in a way that hopefully will inspire the students, inspire the public, and force universities to correct back to what they did so well for so long.
And I want to end on a note of hope, if you think that there is optimism in this, which is, Ayaan, first of all, in the States, we are seeing something of a reversal of a trend when it comes to certain DEI topics, where firms, for example, that previously really committed to DEI standards are now realizing that actually that might not be the only criteria when it comes to hiring. Do you think that actually, as the generations go on, the millennials are almost a kind of blip in this kind of how liberal and I would say liberalism is not the problem here, but this interpretation of liberalism. Do you think that there's actually a trend coming back as society moves backwards a little bit on this one?
Well, what I'm seeing in America now is that we're asking ourselves, which kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in societies that where we value freedom and merit and due process and fairness? Or do we want to live in these cosmetic managed societies where we are literally, some of us, especially in universities, are walking on eggshells all the time, terrified of our own shadow. We're whispering, we're writing the works that we're most proud of anonymously or using pseudonyms. This is terrifying. We don't want to live in a society like that. And so the answer to that is, what is the place of a university in this society that we desire, the one that is free and meritorious and so on? And so I think there's a review now of these wonderful sounding acronyms like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We see them now for what they are. These things are driven by people who are hungry for power, who want to transform our societies. They can't do it through the democratic means of coming to argue for what they believe in Congress or in Parliament or in, their ideas will always lose when it comes to the public opinion. So they have then developed these administrative layers through which they push these things. And so I think there is a pushback. I think the millennials, as much as Gen Z, they've been caught unawares. And I think David knows this better than I do, but there were complaints back in the 1950s and in the 1960s about the fact that American universities were changing. I remember the title of a book, The Closing of the American Mind. And warnings back then were being sounded. And then there was later on titles like The Coddling of the American Mind and so on, which we've been ignoring. But I think it was, yes, a closing of the American mind. And the coddling, it wasn't so much coddling as persuading the American mind to accept to live a life of subservience. And luckily, I see, especially in this election in 2024, a rebellion against that. That is what this, so I think Elon Musk, the rise of Elon Musk's resistance and his takeover of X and the emergence of all of this independent media and hopefully independent universities and even online universities, all of this is a resistance towards that idea of a society that is managed from above.
And finally, David, you say that you're going to be still fighting the fight, but from the outside. What are you going to be doing?
Yes, although it's a sad and in some senses angry piece, a regretful piece that I've written this week, I am positive. I love my subject. I know that the fascination of the Greeks and Romans will endure. And I've recently joined, as a professor of Latin, a new institution called Ralston College, which is based in America, but very unusually spends its first term in Greece, teaching ancient Greek and modern Greek through the spoken method. So the students, who are amazing young individuals, learn to speak ancient Greek, read it fluently, read Homer, read Plato, and we're hoping to bring in a Latin stream of that to study the humanities and the Western tradition more holistically. So I'll still be researching, still be writing, still be reading, and crucially, still be teaching.
Without trigger warnings.
Well, exactly. Yeah, straight to source.
And I hope you'll both still be writing for The Spectator as well. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV today.